She, Dale, she, her. I guess to start with, I'll talk about my interest in wanting to write the book. The time period specifically was really because a lot has been written already about the gas boom in Muncie from the 1880s until the turn of the century. And of course also the 20s and 30s is known for a lot of different things, one of which being the Middletown studies, and of course also our status Little Chicago, and of course also the Klan years as well. But there's this in-between period of time that's mostly known for being a time of just stagnation, really, industrial stagnation for Muncie. And there's really a lot about those years that really explains the rise of the Klan in Muncie and why it was such a hotbed, why Muncie was such a hotbed for their activities. And so part of that being the political turmoil in terms of city politics here, and also part of that being the disillusionment that was happening as a result of World War I. And not only what we know about with shell shock from what soldiers went through after the war, but also from kind of broadly speaking with society, we had what's considered a nervous epidemic. And so to quote one historian who had this interpretation, Roger Nash, the decade after the war was a time of heightened anxiety, when intellectual guideposts were sorely needed and diligently sought. Many clung tightly to the familiar moorings of traditional values and customs. Others actively sought new ways of understanding and ordering their existence. Americans from 1917 to 1930 constituted a nervous generation, groping for what certainty they could find. In retrospect, we tend to look at the 1920s for the most rebellious acts of the time. We think about flappers and jazz cigars, or the Hemingway novels, and through the lens of rebels of the age. Things that only tell us of a period where everyone's life was cosmopolitan and liberated, or revolutionary and bizarre, as Nash put it. While this life did exist, it doesn't explain exactly why the general public reacted to those years by clinging to the very opposite impulse. For one, it was an irrational backlash to social change, but a result of living at the cusp of the interwar period. The end of World War I caused disillusionment over what the future would entail, or a nervous epidemic. And besides World War I, there was a political turmoil going on in Muncie. Our previous mayor, Roland Bunch, who served for most of the 1910s, had just returned from a prison sentence for mail fraud just before the next city election in 1921. His corruption scandals played a role not only in giving credit to his Republican opponent, John C. Quick, but moreover to the nervous nativism espoused by his party. And much of the rhetoric at the time regarding clean government implicated a desire to keep immigrants out of the political process, along with mass democracy and workers' movements. The Republican Party in Indiana had sided with the Anti-Saloon League and other prohibition groups who were also in favor of the national immigration restrictions of the early 20s. Oh, you know what, sorry, go back more. I'm so sorry. There we go. And so the organizing of the Klan in Muncie was overshadowed in the local news by a city election that same year. But in the following year, in 1922, noise spread quick. If such a taker of the community hadn't been exposed yet, it was felt in the air all the same. And any of the calls for clean government to fight off machine politics were quickly manifesting into absolutist mindsets, with violence as a quick answer. The summer of 1922 is when the presence of the KKK became glaringly obvious. It was in June when a black man named Robert Bledsoe was kidnapped and beaten by men in masks, and City Attorney Clarence Benedum was quick to deny any connection of the incident with the Klan. Yet Benedum himself was affiliated not only with the KKK, but with the Mussolini-inspired Silver Shirts a decade later. In one case, when a march took place that summer, there were orders for the chief of police to keep the streets clear and prevent that Klan rally, and for ignoring those orders, he was soon removed from his position as a result. But 3 days later, Mayor Quick was pressured to reinstate him, proving the kind of influence the Klan held in Muncie. Later that year, on September 6th, prominent Klansman Edward Young Clark spoke to a crowd in McCullough Park to explain that the organization, quote, stood unequivocally for the perpetual control of America by the white race, not by might, but by right. McCullough Park would be segregated during this time by city orders. A black Indianapolis attorney, Henry Alexander, was forced by police out of the white area of the park. He decided to file a lawsuit in July of 1923, but Delaware County Circuit Court Judge Clarence Durth, an active Klansman, ruled against Alexander's defense. At the same church, Reverend Harry Hersey witnessed several church members in a Klan parade on a Saturday afternoon. The next day for his sermon, he admonished the Klan and advised his congregate not to join. He would have to resign not long after the fact. Though there were some rare moments of justice against the Klan, When a scrap dealer named Sherman Ziegler was young, he was denied the opportunity to be a newspaper boy for one of the city papers because he was Jewish. This led to a boycott through the withholding of advertising, and soon Ziegler was able to work for the paper. Opposition was needed in any place it could be done. From those who refused to take their hats off from Klan parades, to the students at Notre Dame who drove the Klan off their campus, to those who brought the fight against any and all institutions of power, propping up the invisible empire. And so when it comes to my own interest in this time and place, and why I've spent so much time writing about this, it has to do with my own family's opposition. In Muncie in the 1920s, there was my great-great-grandfather, George R. Dale, who had just started his own paper, the Muncie Post-Democrat. And of the things he became most known for reporting, it was his decision to put the local Klan's membership lists in print and using satire to mock their activities. For doing that, white crosses were burned in the family's front yard, members spat on him on the streets, legal battles became constant and predictable, and threats against his livelihood were numerous, which also included bullets being fired inches away from his youngest son. While he would see some success for going after the Invisible Empire, reaching thousands of copies sold per week by the end of 1922, the threats and legal challenges were only beginning. George attempted to apply for a gun permit and was eagerly granted one by the chief of police, yet shortly thereafter, he would be arrested for carrying despite the permission granted. The permit was a setup, and he was convicted and fined $90 in one of many prolonged cases. In another case, he would be charged with libel for calling a Klansman, quote, 100% a draft dodger, which also took multiple years. He became well known for his rivalry against Judge Clarence Durth, who he accused not only of being a Klansman, but of stacking juries with other members. In one of his contempt cases, Durth would be angered by George enough that he said the editor should move to Russia if he doesn't like it in Muncie. George became immune to how many legal hurdles he had against him, and would be thrown in the Delaware County Jail so often that inmates would applaud him every time he was brought in. For his stance against bootlegging, he notably didn't hold back at the hypocrisy of leaders who drank, despite their avowed support of prohibition. Klan leader Edward Young Clark, an imperial wizard, had a whiskey bottle found in his car while giving a speech at McCullough Park. And in the next weekly issue, George called Clark the biggest fraud and hypocrite in America. If the hypocrisy surrounding the Klan leaders was showing by this point, then the horrid treatment of women by Grand Dragon D.C. Stevenson from Indianapolis brought their grotesque nature to the public eye officially. His stenographer, Madge Oberholzer, was kidnapped and raped by Stevenson, leading to her attempted suicide and subsequently fatal infection, caused by the bite marks left by Stevenson. Oberholzer's account of the event was posthumously released by the family lawyer and used to bring Stevenson to trial. George was at that trial, and one writer from the American Mercury described him as, quote, a shabby little old man, a pencil in one hand, a wad of paper in the other, eternally scribbling while a pair of piercing black eyes under shaggy white hair seemed to be boring their way through Steve's brain. Stevenson was served 31 years in prison. The Klan of this era was starting to show its signs of degrade year by year, and its downfall became inevitable. The members that were part of Muncie's financial elite were starting to leave from this point forward, and the Indiana Bar Association famously voted to condemn the organization. George was many opponents who saw vindication in the end, but from the legal challenges, the financial debt, and the ongoing threats, George and his family were barely standing. George said, quote, I lost my advertising, most of my subscribers, my home, my liberty, and every dollar I had in the world. But from out of the legal fights and the nationwide storm of attention, he ran for mayor of Muncie in the next election and won. The election of 1929 was a repudiation of what the Ku Klux Klan had done to the Hoosier community, and if the fall of the Invisible Empire was obvious by the midst of the decade, then what followed was an embarrassing and tragic reminder. Membership lists, at least those that weren't destroyed, were continually published for years after the fact. Judge Clarence Durth was ousted for his limits to free press, freedom of speech and freedom of press, and the ongoing legal troubles he threw at George were only putting the conditions of Muncie into the national spotlight. George's first act as mayor would be to fire the entire police force, whose members he believed were part of the Klan. The Klan in Indiana would never reach the height it had in the 1920s, but those years of the Invisible Empire only continue to hold dark memories of marches downtown and pamphlets being distributed only to intimidate. Delaware County Prosecutor Mick Alexander investigated racial violence in the early 1980s and discovered that the Klan created its own youth vigilante group to police neighborhoods, and uncovered the cross burnings and literature being sent to public officials. Some towns in our state had Klan organizations so active in this time frame that in the town of Elwood, a mayor's win would be credited for their activities. I think often about another circumstance just a decade before that, the late 1960s, where then council member here in Muncie, Bob Cunningham, decided to support an open housing ordinance by directly telling local reporters his belief that everyone should have the right to live wherever they want. After making that exact statement, he had his grocery store firebombed, but he knew the intimidation would only continue to give him strength while also hearkening back to strength from before. Oftentimes for me, it can feel like the research we try and do and education we do as activists is the last thing we should be worried about right now. It can feel like a distraction from real action and finding the leverage wherever we currently need it. Recently, though, I did have an experience where we collaborated with a couple of nonprofits, one of them being the Muncie Liberation Studio, another being Muncie Queer Alliance, as well as the Muncie Post-Democrat, including an article I wrote about this too, about Harvey Milk and his own activism in San Francisco. And even though that felt very insular, that felt very just like we were having a dialogue within the queer community in Muncie, and it didn't really go very far beyond that, there was still a legacy for us to build strength from. For Harvey Milk, that was a legacy of vigilance, and a legacy of hope, and a legacy of action. And when there's leverage from decades ago that's been lost and forgotten, it's just waiting to be discovered again. And whether that meant it meant finding social agency in your community, or the striking workers of the 30s who fought for in the workplace, there's always that leverage to find. It may only be the memory bit that's endured, but that memory revels more hope tomorrow. The invite here means everything. Thank you so much. And please join us in the closing song, We Would Be One.